It was a particularly cold morning, February 2nd, 1829, in North Yorkshire, England. Presumably people were walking with their heads down to protect their faces from the cold wind and to better navigate the icy ground, and that's why it wasn't until 7 a.m., when a man named Swainbank slipped on the ice and landed on his back, that someone noticed that there was smoke coming from the roof of York Minster Cathedral. The trial of Jonathan Martin for the shocking arson against the medieval cathedral was a sensation at the time, and an early test of the defense of not guilty by reason of insanity. It is history that deserves to be remembered. In 2006, BBC News announced the city of York in the north of England has been dominated for 1,000 years by a great church. A 1961 history of the county of York notes that by the 4th century the city had become one of the centers of Romano-British Christianity, but there is no clear record of a church building at York recorded until the year 627, when King Edwin of Northumbria converted to Christianity. In his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, monk and chronicler Bede wrote, "He was baptized at York on the holy day of Easter, being the 12th of April, in the church of St. Peter the Apostle, which he himself had built of timber there in haste." That is the first reference to a church built on the site of what is called York Minster. Bede goes on. After his baptism, he built a greater and more majestic church of stone, enclosing in its midst his first wooden oratory. Edwin's stone cathedral was destroyed by fire in 741. A new building was destroyed by an invasion of Danes in 1075. Between 1080 and 1150, a new building in the Norman style was constructed. The present Gothic building was begun in 1220 and completed in 1472. The seat of the Archbishop of York, while the official name is Cathedral and Metropolitical Church of St. Peter in York, in the medieval period the church was associated with a monastery, and as a large and important cathedral attached to a monastery, it has been commonly called York Minster, Minster being an Old English word for monastery. The cathedral is often described as the largest medieval Gothic cathedral in northern Europe. By 1829, York Minster nearly defined the city of York. BBC News goes on. Even as recently as the 19th century, few among the townspeople would have known anything of the origins of the cathedral in their midst. Local folklore did not recall a time before the Minster. A March 7, 1829 letter in the Leeds Mercury said of the great cathedral, "The towers and body of the Minster rise so high above the houses by which they are surrounded, and all the other churches of the city, that a spectator at a distance of a few miles sees nothing of York, except its cathedral." It is difficult to imagine anyone wishing to do harm to such a landmark, except for the nature of insanity. BBC News opines, its scale and grandeur far surpassed any other building that the general populace had seen or could imagine, and so the veneration of this house of God was absolute. For the man who attempted to destroy it, hatred was assured. One of 12 children that included his brother John, who had become a famous artist. In his autobiography, Jonathan Martin says merely of his early years that he was born in the year 1762 in the parish of Hexham in Northumberland of poor but honest parents, who in due time put me apprentice to the tanning business, in which time nothing occurred worthy of relating. In fact, those years were more disturbing than that. It's difficult to tell what all influenced Jonathan's later mental state. Several accounts describe a strict religious upbringing, although various accounts say that it was at the hands of his mother, grandmother, or an aunt. BBC News writes, young Jonathan learned that there was a God to serve and a hell to shun, and all liars and swearers are burned in hell. He experienced visions from about the age of 8, and he became convinced that thunderstorms were visited on the neighborhood as a divine punishment for his own unconscious sins. Museum Northumberland writes, his early years in Northumberland were troubled. Until he was 6 years old, he was tongue-tied, a condition known as ankyloglossia, which make talking very difficult. He became a loner and often got up in the middle of the night to walk among the lead mines of Hexhamshire. His sister was a close companion in childhood, but when Martin witnessed her murder, she was thrown down a stone staircase by a neighbor. He entered into a downward spiral. At the age of 22, he traveled to London, where he fell victim to a press gang and spent the next 6 years in the Royal Navy. His autobiography notes several adventures in the Navy, although it's not clear what from his stories is actually reliable. A shipmate said of him, he used to say he was fitter for a parson than a sailor, nicknamed him Parson Sachs. He was often sulky and idle. He did not pray much, but was inclined to argue on religious subjects. He described many close calls to his life, but insists that he was always preserved by an act of God, writing, "The Lord in an especial manner showed me I was under his protecting care." But for all his religious fervor, he was hardly saintly in his behavior, writing that once he became so drunk that after traveling on some miles through a wood, on recovering my senses, I found that I had lost my trousers, but whether they had been exchanged for wine or not, I did not remember. At least one event in this time in the Navy might have been important, as the Darlington Northern Echo writes. During one maritime battle, he suffered a serious blow to the head, possibly a fracture of the skull, which could account for what came later. He left the Navy in 1810 and went back into the trade of tanning. He married and had a son, but it seems his religious fervor took a turn after the tragedy of losing his parents. The Darlington Echo continues. Things really began to go awry in 1814 when both of his parents died. His mother returned to him in a vision, warning that he would be hanged. Soon God was appearing in clouds and in dreams, and Jonathan's behavior began to deteriorate. He joined the Wesleyan Methodists, the Ranters, and began a personal crusade against the Church of England, whose leaders he believed led degenerate and frivolous lives. In his autobiography, he wrote, "I knew that the clergy were in the habit of going to balls, plays, races, card parties, and other sources of amusement, and instead of warning their flocks to flee from the wrath to come, were setting them a most pernicious example." Museum Northumberland writes, he adopted an austere Methodism. He saw himself as inherently sinful, while also believing that he was called to punish the sins of others. This manifested in stark, vivid dreams that he often committed to paper. For a time, he even dressed in sealskins and rode on a donkey. While this behavior was unusual, it was not perceived as dangerous. But his crusade against the clergy of the Church of England became more extreme. After being forcibly removed from a church for disrupting the service, he addressed a letter to the clergy. "Oh, hear the word of the Lord, you clergymen, for the mighty sword is expanded over your guilty heads. Now shall you come to complete dissolution. Now shall your candlesticks become completely overthrown. Now shall your blindness come to light, and your shame before all the people. For the Lord will not suffer you to deceive the works of his hands any longer. Oh, prepare yourselves to meet your God, you double-hearted sinners." He signed the letter, Jonathan Martin, your sincere friend. His writings were full of visions and prophecies, yet he still wasn't perceived as dangerous. But that was about to change. In 1818, he wrote, "About this time the bishop, I think of Lincoln, was to hold a confirmation at Stockton for the Bishop of Durham. I had heard that he was a good man and that numbers attended his visitation. I was glad to hear such a good report of him and concluded that if he were really so good a man and so eminent a Christian, he would not fear death, and resolved to try his faith by pretending to shoot him. He acquired a pistol, and some officious person heard of it. Called before a magistrate, I was asked if I had a pistol to shoot the bishop with, to which I replied that I did not mean to injure the man, although I considered they all deserved shooting, being blind leaders of the blind." That was, it seems, plenty enough to have him committed to an asylum. He escaped, was recaptured and put in chains, but managed to use a stone to wear off the rivets on his manacles, and escaped again through a hole in the roof. This time authorities seemed to put little effort into returning him. The Darlington Echo writes, he regarded his escape as a God-given miracle, although the authorities do not seem to have been much too concerned, because they let him live unhindered in Darlington for the best part of 6 years. He wandered quite a lot during this period. His wife died, and he remarried. He continued his preaching against the Church of England, although he was disavowed by the Methodists by now. York Castle in the 19th century writes that he made many threats with regards to the clergy, which alarmed and distressed his wife, but as he was a peaceable man, these were regarded as mere menaces. The Bethlem Museum of the Mind of Bethlem Royal Hospital writes, at the end of 1828, Martin arrived in York and addressed several warning letters to the clergy there, exhorting them to repent of their bottles of wine and roast beef and plum pudding, if they wished to escape from the wrath to come. The Royal College of Physicians, Edinburgh, notes, over time his mental instability grew, and he became obsessed by the idea of being tasked by God to cleanse York Minster, saying later at his trial that, I felt a voice inwardly speak, that the Lord had chosen me to destroy the cathedral for the wrong that was being done by the clergy, and going to plays and balls and card tables and dinners, and I thought I should be fulfilling the word of God. On Sunday, February 1st, he attended services in York Minster. He later told authorities that he snuck over a gate during prayers and hid behind a tomb. He waited until the bell ringers went home, and then the first thing I did was that of getting all the books that I could, cushions that were necessary, piled them up in 2 heaps, set one pile on fire at the Archbishop's throne and the other on the right side of the organ. He made his escape, and the fire was not noticed until the next morning. BBC News notes, the nave of York Minster is and was the widest in England. The 2 files of columns on either side of it stand 16 meters apart. The design of the Norman architects proved too ambitious, and so the original vault of stone was never completed. York Minster instead possessed a wooden roof, one of the largest in Europe and a marvel of medieval engineering. The roof was doomed. The firefighters were forced to evacuate the choir area as debris began to rain down. Soon molten lead was streaming from the spouting. A little before noon, the first of the crossbeams failed and the others succumbed in quick succession. In a series of progressive collapses, the blazing timbers plunged into the ruin of the choir. The Exeter Flying Post wrote of the fire, "I sit down with feelings with which you may imagine, but which mock description, to give you the earliest intimation of a calamity the most awful and most unlooked for that could have occurred. It is no less than the total destruction of the interior of York Minster, including the noble organ, from the lantern tower to the great east window, by fire." The fire was not fully extinguished until February 3rd. A full and authentic report of the trial of Jonathan Martin, published in 1829, writes, "The knotted rope having been discovered by which Martin made his escape and not satisfactorily accounted for, and it's being rumored that a bunch of matches had also been found which had been lighted at both ends. The opinion that the fire was not caused by gas or by candles being left in the organ loft or in the clergyman's robing room, which had at first been entertained, began to give way to the idea that it was the work of an incendiary." Immediately suspicion fell upon Martin, who had been writing threatening letters with phrases like, "Your great minsters and churches will come rattling down upon your guilty heads." He had signed the letters and even given the address to which he was staying in York. He had by then fled, but was apprehended a week later near his home. Under questioning, he confessed. Martin's trial was a great sensation, so much so that tickets had to be issued to keep the courtroom from being overcrowded. The Chester Chronicle wrote, "The ladies exerted all their influence to procure tickets from the sheriff, and judging by the great numbers that were present, it would seem their exertions were not unsuccessful. The admission to the grand jury box and the north gallery were also confined to the ladies, and admission to the south gallery was also limited to persons having tickets." According to the account of the trial, when the prosecutor read the first count, charging him with having, on the morning of the 2nd February, feloniously set fire to the Cathedral Church of St. Peter of York, Jonathan listened very attentively. While the indictment was reading, and on being asked the usual question, "What say you, Jonathan Martin? Are you guilty or not guilty?" Martin, throwing himself into a theatrical attitude, said, "It was not me, my lord, but my God did it. It is quite common for him to punish to the 3rd and 4th generation, to show mercy to them that fear him, and keep his commandments." The Leeds Mercury wrote, "This strange declaration was taken and recorded as a plea of not guilty." When asked about a second charge of stealing a quantity of velvet and gold fringe from the church, he said, "My God gave me that for my hire. The Lord gave me the silk to make a robe like David the king, and the velvet to make a cap, and the tassels I took from the pulpit to hang down over my right and left ear." This was also taken as a plea of not guilty. Martin's attorney was Henry Brougham, who had become famous for defending Queen Caroline, the estranged wife of King George IV, from charges of adultery. Martin's brother John paid for the defense. Brown brought experts claiming that Martin suffered from monomania, described as a form of partial insanity, conceived of as single pathological preoccupation in an otherwise sound mind. Thus, Martin could seem a perfectly capable man, and owing to his religious delusions, still not be responsible for his acts. And it worked. The jury only deliberated for 10 minutes before they came back with a verdict. They said, "We find him guilty, but consider that he was insane at the time that he committed the act." The judge replied that that was in fact a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, and that's the verdict that was recorded. Martin was sent to the infamous Bethlehem Asylum, commonly called Bedlam, where he spent the rest of his life. A reporter from the newspaper The Guardian wrote that Martin was precisely the man with whom it was a pleasure to converse, but on the subject of religion, he is obviously a reasoning madman. The reporter replied, "I think this extraordinary deed was really the work of a man whose insanity, it were insanity, to doubt." Yorkshire Magazine said of him, "Jonathan spent the rest of his days quietly, painting and behaving as a model patient, as long as the topic of religion was avoided." It's not completely clear what Martin's insanity was. Monomania is no longer an accepted diagnosis and was really never more than a term that was used to make a doctor look credible in front of a jury. Mania brought on by bipolar disorder is the explanation that's most often advanced today. The verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity is particularly interesting because it came 14 years ahead of the Macnaghten rules, when Parliament actually defined the meaning of not guilty by reason of insanity, based on the acquittal of a man who tried to assassinate the Prime Minister. The damage to the cathedral was repaired within 3 years, and the removal of the rubble revealed evidence of the original Norman crypt. The area discovered houses a museum today. The Darlington Echo notes that Martin's brother John's paintings were typically vast apocalyptic religious scenes like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. His work is of such awful intensity that he was known as Mad Martin, and he was so famous that a lady in the crowd that had gathered to see York Minster burn exclaimed, "What a subject for John Martin to paint," not knowing at the time that it was his brother who had set the fire. York Minster suffered another significant fire in 1984, which burned away much of the roof. This one almost certainly caused by lightning, something that's somewhat ironic because, as BBC News notes, Jonathan Martin saw judgment in thunderstorms. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.